Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Tuesday education session. My name is Peggy Rauman and I am one of the nursing consultants for policy and practice here at the college. And it is with great pleasure today that I introduce my colleague, Michelle Carpenter. She is a registered nurse and also a nursing consultant for policy and practice here at the college. And she is going to present to you today our revised scope of practice document for registered nurses and nurse practitioners in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the suite of supporting documents accompanying it. So over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Peggy. Well, I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk about the new scope of practice framework and the suite of supporting documents that was approved by Council in June 2022. Today I'm going to talk about the scope of practice of RNs and NPs in Newfoundland and Labrador. So where does this authority come for the college to, revise our documents and create a new suite of supporting documents and scope of practice framework? Well, the college, through the RN Act 2008 and the RN Regulations 2013, the provincial government provided the authority to the College of Registered Nurses as a self-regulated profession to set the standards and scope of practice for RNs and NPs in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we often get asked, where's the list? Because previous to 2006, we did have a list of competencies that an RN or a nurse practitioner could perform. But the RN Act does not limit or differentiate the type of client an RN is authorized to care for or limit the environment where that care occurs. So since 2006, we haven't had a list because there isn't any, limits on the type of client an RN is authorized to care for. So within their scope of practice, RNs may autonomously provide care regardless of the complexity of client care or the predictability of client outcomes. So we do not maintain a list of competencies due to the individual and changing nature of RN and NP scope of practice. And since 2006, the scope of practice of RNs and NPs have evolved immensely from that period. So we're going to talk a little bit about the NP scope of practice, which is different from the RN scope of practice. And nurse practitioners are RNs with advanced educational preparation and experience, which enables them to autonomously diagnose, treat, and manage acute and chronic physical and mental illnesses. They are authorized to independently perform a range of health services that extend beyond those of a registered nurse. They possess the competency to provide comprehensive health assessments, identify health risks and health needs. They can diagnose diseases, disorders, injuries, and conditions, and they discuss health assessment results, diagnosis, prognosis, and outcomes with clients and/or healthcare team. And so there's no legislative restrictions on NP's authority to perform these activities. The scope of practice, like the RN scope of practice, is very broad, and we'll talk about the factors that determine a scope of practice for each of these groups. The NP scope of practice reflects the advanced competencies that they receive in their educational program, the nurse practitioner program. So the scope of practice of an NP is further defined by the level of competence, so that the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment that that NP possesses. It's also the category of practice, and then the practice setting. And under the RN regulation, section 14.1, which stipulates that the NP is authorized to order the application of a form of energy permitted by the standards established by the council. And as I said in the previous slide, the provincial government has granted that authority to CRNNL to set the standards of practice and the scope of practice. So any change in the scope of practice of a nurse practitioner or is approved by the college's council. And they also stipulate that NPs can order laboratory or other tests, such as diagnostic tests, permitted by the standards established by the council. And it also stipulates that an RN can prescribe a drug permitted by the standards established by the council. So we often get questions about what are forms of energy. Well, forms of energy include, but are not limited to, a CT scan, an MRI, a PET scan, an ultrasound, a chest x-ray. So there's many forms of energy that NPs are authorized to prescribe. So when we talked about scope, we said that NPs practice within their level of competence, category of practice, and practice setting. Now, you may have heard previously streams of practice for NPs, but we now call it categories of practice because that's what's reflected in the regulations. So within Newfoundland and Labrador, we license nurse practitioners in 3 categories. The first is family all ages, and those NPs provide care for clients across the lifespan, including newborns, children, adolescents, adults, pregnant and postpartum women, and older adults in a generalized or a specialty practice setting. And then we license nurse practitioners in adult category. And these individuals provide care for individuals 18 years of age and older in either a generalized adult practice where they see adults with a variety of medical conditions and/or adults in a generalized or specialty practice setting. And in some cases, care of older adolescents may be provided when the adolescent's age and/or condition may closely approximate that of an adult. And then the third category is pediatric. And this category provides care for individuals under the age of 18 in either a generalized practice where they see individuals with a variety of medical conditions or individuals in a generalized or specialty practice setting. And in some instances, they provide care to young adults whose developmental age may closely approximate that of a child or an adolescent rather than an adult, or a young adult who has been receiving care from the nurse practitioner, pediatric, for a chronic disease since childhood. And under that category, we have a subspecialty, and that's the neonatal nurse practitioner. And neonatal practitioners are registered with within the pediatric category, but have specialized education relevant to neonatology. Now, if you're not aware, there is a national project underway that is looking at 6 elements of NP regulation. And one of those under that NP regulation is that we're moving towards one category of practice and one national registration exam. And the first step to move in that direction is that the nurse practitioner entry-level competencies needed to be refreshed. And that has occurred over the past 18 months, and hopefully will go to council for approval in February. And then from that, we'll have move to one category of practice and one national registration exam. So here's what our new scope of practice framework looks like. And you can find this document under on our new website under practice resources, and practice topics. And this is where the framework and the suite of supporting documents is found under the practice topic of scope of practice. So our new document is referred to as the scope of practice framework. And then we have the suite of supporting documents. So we have a fact sheet that reviews the question or allows the nurse to review in a 1-pager, am I allowed to do that? And then we have a document called Understanding Individual Scope of Practice. And I will go into each of these documents further in the presentation. And then we have another document called Care or Medical Directives and Pre-Printed Orders. We also have a document called Differentiating Scope of Practice within the Nursing Profession, Assignment of Care, and Employers Adding a New and Emerging Competency. So when we talk about scope of nursing practice, what are we referring to? Well, we are referring to the range of roles, functions, responsibilities, and activities within which RNs and NPs are educated and authorized to perform to assist clients to achieve health. So when we're talking about scope of practice statements, we're identifying the boundaries of a discipline. So when we're talking about the scope of nursing practice, we're talking about the boundaries of the nursing profession. and what a RN or nurse practitioner can perform. What are they limited to, and what are they able to perform? There are some factors that influence the scope of practice of nursing in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I talked a little bit about the first two, the RN Act and the RN regulations. So the RN Act and the RN regulations is very broad, and it says that council or CRNNL has the authority to set the scope of practice for registered nurses and nurse practitioners in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then the RN regulations further defines what's within the scope of a nurse practitioner. And there are other relevant laws that influence the scope of practice. For example, if you're participating in medical assistance in dying, well, there is law that outlines how that is carried out in the environment where the RN or nurse practitioner is situated. And in that piece of law, it says only an RN or a physician, a medical practitioner, can provide MAID. And then we have other pieces of legislation, whether federal or provincial, that would influence the scope of practice of the nursing profession. And then we have our college's standards of practice that, outlines the minimum expectations for practice. The code of ethics is that ethical decision-making framework that allows RNs to make decisions and reflect on their ethical values and responsibilities. And then we have other relevant college documents that outlines practice expectations. For example, if you're going to dispense medications, if you're going to participate in virtual nursing practice, well, the scope of that competency is outlined in those practice expectations that's outlined in those documents. And then the scope of practice is influenced by individual RN and NP competencies. What are those competencies that they achieved in nursing school? And then when you go to a particular practice setting, what competencies do you learn and achieve through continuing education and experience? And then your scope of practice is further influenced by the employer policies. So what does the RHA or an organization, if you work outside of an RHA, say about using mobile devices in the workplace? What does it say about medication management? All of those policies will influence how care is provided and what competencies you're allowed to perform in your practice setting. And then ultimately, there are the client's needs. So the scope of practice will be determined by what the population needs are in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And based on that, those are the competencies that individual RNs and NPs will bring into their scope of practice in order to provide the care that is required by the client. So this is our new scope of practice framework, and it defines the scope of practice for the profession and the individual RN and NP. It will help determine whether a competency falls within their individual scope of practice or whether they should perform that competency. So if you're, on your unit and you're struggling to determine whether a competency falls within your scope or whether you should perform that competency. And, this document will help you to reflect on those questions and whether you should move forward or whether you should seek consultation or other resources to help you determine whether you can use that competency. And, this document will help you if it's, after hours on the weekend when, you can't call the college or professional practice, or maybe your clinical educators doesn't work on the weekend, to help you determine whether it's within your scope or should you move forward in performing that competency. And it outlines 3 elements that an RN and NP must reflect on before performing a competency. And these are the key things that the key takeaways from this presentation when you're thinking about, is a competency within your individual scope of practice? And you reflect on these 3 elements of, am I educated to perform that competency? Am I authorized to perform that competency by my employer or organization? And am I competent to perform that competency, and can I safely manage the outcomes of the competency provided in my practice setting? And if at any time you're unsure of those three elements, then you need to consult and you need to seek additional supports before you move forward. So here's a visual depiction of those three elements, and I'm going to go through those individually. So first of all, as I said, you need to think about before you move forward and perform that competency is think about, am I educated? So did you learn it in your entry to practice nursing program, whether it's in your Bachelor of Science of Nursing program, whether it's in your Master of Nursing nurse practitioner program, and that at the current time would be, your nursing program for family all ages and adult, which is in Newfoundland. Those are the two programs, but in other parts of Canada, you can do a pediatric nurse program or a neonatal nurse practitioner program. So you got to think about, did you receive it in your nursing program? Did you have it as one of those entry-level competencies when you graduated? If not, then you need to bring that competency into your scope of practice through continuing education. And, you need to have education on that competency. And that education can be formal. It can be, a formal program that you do in person or online. You may have to do a pre and post test and you get a certificate, or you might have to write an exam, but it could be informal. It could be at the bedside where the physician or nurse practitioner educates you on a new procedure. So, or it could be the clinical educator. So it could be, that formal and informal methods to receive that continuing education. But a part of that continuing education must have a theory and practical. It is not enough to stand at the bedside and just have someone say, okay, here is how to do the procedure. You need some theory. Now, again, that doesn't have to be formal. It can be very informal, but there must be a theory and practical component before you perform that competency. And there also has to be a form of validation. Now, the college does not set what that validation process is. That's done by the employer. And in some settings, the employer may say, okay, you need to demonstrate to either your clinical educator or a RN and NP who's competent in that competency. And you may have to return demonstrate that competency maybe 3 times or 4 times. You're signed off on a checklist, and then you're deemed ready to perform that. And then another part of that is that you must maintain competency in that particular competency, because if you haven't done it for a year or 2 years, then you need to think about, am I competent to perform that skill? So maybe I need to get some refresher education on that competency. So you've determined, yep, I'm good to go, I'm educated. And then we look at, am I authorized? And when we look at authorization, we need to look at what categories of authorization must be in place before an RN can perform a nursing competency. And first of all, we look at legislation. So what are those activities that you're going to perform? They must be in accordance with the various federal and/or provincial laws that govern or direct nursing practice. So we need to look at, okay, is there anything in federal or provincial territorial laws that would prevent me from performing that competency? So let's look at the Federal Food and Drug Act and regulations. It says in those pieces of legislation that an RN cannot give out drug samples. Now, prior to 2021, NPs could not provide drug samples. But now, with the law change, NPs are permitted if they follow certain criteria, but RNs cannot give out drug samples. So it doesn't matter if a physician or nurse practitioner gives you a drug sample to give to the client. you can't give that drug sample. And then we need to look at the college, the College of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador. The activities that you are contemplating to perform must be recognized by the college to be practiced as an RN and NP in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we actually have a definition in the scope of practice framework that defines what is the practice of a registered nurse and what is the practice of a nurse practitioner. So I refer you to that document to review. And the college may set specific education and practice requirements for new or high-risk nursing competencies prior to performance. So for example, the college, as I said, the scope of practice is very broad, but if a nurse practitioner wants to prescribe Suboxone or methadone or Sublocade for substance use disorder, they must complete specified education and practice requirements specified by the College of Registered Nurses, and complete an application process and certain education programs and submit all of that data. And then they are granted authority by the college to prescribe those medications. So that's just an example. That's not all inclusive, but those are things to think about. Is there anything that the college says that you can or cannot do? Or is there specific things that you must do in order to bring it into your scope? Then thirdly, we look at the employer. So those are those activities that must be authorized by the employer as approved nursing practice in the specific employment settings. So it's really important that you have authorization by the employer to complete that competency in your practice setting. So the next slide will talk about the forms of employer authorization. But if there isn't a policy in your organization, then you need to advocate to get that policy so that you are authorized to perform that competency if it's required in your practice setting. So the employer must say that you are authorized to perform that competency in your practice setting, because there may be settings where it's not appropriate to perform that competency, and I'll talk about that a little bit throughout the slide. And then the last form of authorization is the client. So you must be authorized through informed consent by the client to perform that competency, because you may be educated, you may be authorized, and if the client says, no, I don't want you to perform that competency, then you stop. And then the final element that you think about is, am I competent? So RNs and NPs must determine whether they have the individual competence to perform a competency. They must determine whether they have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment and personal attributes, so those attitudes, abilities, behaviors, values, to perform the competency for their client. And then they need to consider whether they can appropriately manage the outcomes of care in their practice setting. And this is really key. The RN and NP must consider if it's appropriate to perform that competency in that practice setting, and whether that RN or NP can effectively manage if there's an adverse outcome of care. And there may be practice settings where it may not be appropriate to perform the nursing competencies, for example, outside of an acute care setting or in a client setting in a client's home. So let's think about peritoneal dialysis. The employer may say that you can perform that competency in this particular practice setting, but they may say, no, it's not appropriate to perform that in another unit. If you're taking out a PICC line, which has a potential to have bleeding or hemorrhage, is it appropriate to take that out of the client in a client's home? It may be quite appropriate to take it out in a setting, in an acute care setting, where you can manage those unintended consequences like bleeding, but you may not be able to manage that in a client's home if they start to bleed and they're not within distance of the hospital. So you need to think about, are you able to manage the outcomes of care? So can you safely perform the competency And can you safely manage the outcomes? And consideration must be given to ensuring unintended consequences of care can be managed effectively. So you have to think about, do I have access to emergency equipment? Do I have an AED? Is the ambulance service, the EMS, readily available to be able to respond if there is an unintended consequence? And at the end of the day, we need to think about everything you do is in the best interest of the client and within the client's consent. So before you perform a competency, stop and think, am I educated? Yes. Okay, you can proceed. If not, stop and consider or consult. Okay, what education do I need? Do I need to talk to the clinical educator? Do I need to talk to professional practice? Am I authorized? And again, if you're authorized through these 4 mechanisms, then you can proceed. If not, stop and consult and seek supports. And then you think about, are you competent? Do you have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment? If you do, great, you can proceed. If you don't, then you need to seek resources in order to become competent. And then the final consideration is, can you safely perform that competency? If not, seek resources and further education. And can you safely manage the outcomes? So if you're unsure, then don't perform that right away. Consult, find out, do you have the necessary emergency equipment? Is there things that need to be put in place so that you can safely manage those outcomes and unintended consequences? So I talked about some employer authorization, and that can come in many different forms. It could be an employer policy. It could be an employer guideline. Authorization comes through your role or job description, and it details what's expected of you in that unit or that particular role or practice setting. We also have medical or care directives. Our document has been updated to be called care directives, but it was formerly known as medical directives. Then we have pre-printed orders. Authorization is achieved through delegation. So there may be emergency situations where a competency is not in the scope of an RN, but through special a permission by the physician or nurse practitioner, senior management, a discussion of how you're going to manage that competency, and then you may be delegated to perform that competency. That is not something that is then brought into your competency. This is like time specific and is generally not in the scope of an RN. And I encourage you to read more about that in our scope of practice framework. And then you're authorized through an assignment of care. With your scope of practice and those in your collaborative team, through your individual scopes of practice, you're assigned to different clients, and that you're authorized to provide care within your scope of practice through an assignment of care. So now I'm going to look at the individual suite of documents. So the first document that is on your screen is a fact sheet. So we developed a one-pager that explains in a concise way the 3 elements to consider when pondering whether to perform a particular competency. So we get asked a lot of times, in fact, Peggy and I, that is the leading question when we get practice calls, is scope of practice questions. Am I allowed to do that? So, we encourage you to read the scope of practice framework, but in a emergency or a quick situation that you need to know right away, here's a one-pager that talks about that decision tree that I had, those 3 elements. And so it's a quick one-pager that you can take in the middle of the night and say, okay, am I allowed to do that? Am I educated? Am I authorized? And am I competent? And can I manage the outcome? So that can help you in a pinch if you want to refer to that. But I encourage you to read the full document scope of practice framework to get all the information that is the additional information. Then we have the document differentiating the scope of practice within the profession. And this helps to explain how the scope of practice of the profession differs from the scope of practice of an individual RN or a newly graduated RN and NP. And sometimes that's really important because people don't understand what it means that the RN, newly graduated RN, brings a certain scope of practice as opposed to a scope of practice that is in your individual unit. And then we have all of the competencies that is contained in the nursing profession. So we have a diagram this particular document that explains the different scopes of practice within the nursing profession. And here I refer to RNs and NPs. And the scope of practice of the profession represents all that is taught in entry to practice or entry-level basic nursing education programs, graduate nursing degree programs, and in continuing education programs, pardon me. It also includes competencies that are added to the role as the profession evolves in various practice settings and domains of practice to be responsive to the evolving healthcare environment and health-related needs of the public. So prior to 2016, it was not within the scope of the nursing profession to be involved in medical assistance in dying. We are also evolving the profession that we're looking to move RN prescribing into the scope of practice of the profession. And by developing certain documents, the college has brought advanced foot care, for example, into the scope of practice of the nursing profession. So that outer navy circle is all of the competencies that are within the nursing profession, and not one RN or NP will possess all of the competencies of the nursing profession. And then we look at the gray circle, the smallest circle. It's the scope of practice of the newly graduated nurse. It's the beginning practitioner. And from a practical perspective, it's the smallest and most limited circle and represents the roles, functions, responsibilities, and activities that students learn in their entry to practice nursing education program. And the nursing education programs curricula prepare nurses to meet entry-level competencies upon graduation. And those are the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment required to enter into practice and provide safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care in nursing practice at a beginner practitioner level. It further establishes the foundation for nursing practice and represents the new practitioner's initial expected level of competence or scope of practice. So when you graduate from your nursing program, you have a certain scope of practice. You have entry-level competencies that you learned about in your nursing program. And then that inner circle is the scope of practice of the individual RN and NP. And depending on what type of experiences that you received in your nursing program, and then what units you go to work on, each scope of practice of an individual RN will be different, or a nurse practitioner will be different. And the scope of practice of the individual RN or NP is defined as the nursing services for which a registrant is educated, authorized, and competent to perform. An individual RN or NP scope of practice is based on foundational entry to practice education and continues to progress with practice experience and continuing education over a career. RNs and NPs add new competencies to their scope throughout their career as they progress from novice to expert practitioners in various practice settings and domains of practice. And you can see where that inner circle can expand and contract, and hard to see with on the screen, but we kind of say that the individual RN and NP scope of practice can expand and contract, because you think about when you are newly graduated, you go to work on a unit such as urology. You're going to add new competencies into your practice. So you're going to learn all of those things that you need to care about for clients who have on the urology unit. And so your scope of practice is going to expand. But if you stay on that urology unit and you stay there for 10 years and you're moving from that novice to expert, maybe your scope of practice will shrink a little bit because you're focused on that specialty of being a urology nurse. But then there could be something that is brought into the scope of practice of the urology units, and then your scope will expand. So it's that continuous expanding, contracting as you learn new competencies, where some may fall out of your competency because you haven't maintained that competency, or you may not have performed some of those entry level competencies since you graduated from nursing school. The next document is Understanding Individual Scope of Practice. And this document provides further guidance to help understand the individual competence and provides a decision tree that will help determine whether a competency is within an RN's and NP's individual scope of practice. And our purpose of developing the suite of documents that supports the scope of practice framework is giving those resources to the RN or NP to help them determine, is it within my individual competence? And so we also provided a decision tree. There's a number of questions in that document, but first we provided a decision tree that will help you determine and identify, describe, or clarify the activity, intervention, competency, or role under consideration. So first you ask, is the activity, intervention, competency, or role prohibited by any applicable laws, rules, regulations, accreditation standards, or professional nursing scope and standards? If you say that there is a limit, or then you would say stop. So there is something prohibited, so you stop, you consider, and then you consult. Okay, what do I need to find further information about, because I'm not sure if it's prohibited. If it's not prohibited, then you go on to the next level, and is performing the activity, intervention, or role consistent with evidence-informed nursing knowledge and healthcare literature? If the answer is no, then you stop and consult and seek further supports. And if you say yes, then you move on. Is the nurse authorized by the employer to carry out this activity or competency or intervention? Are there practice setting policies and procedures in place to support the performing the activity, competency, intervention, or role? So if there's if you have all of these things in place and is authorized by the employer, then you can move on to the next question. If not, you stop, consult. You need to find out if there are policies or not. And then the next question, has the nurse completed the necessary education to safely, competently, compassionately, and ethically perform the activity, competency, intervention, or role? So if you haven't completed the necessary information or education, then you say no, and you stop. Okay, so what additional education do I need to perform that I would be required to perform that competency safely and competently? The next question, is there documented evidence of the nurse's current competence? Do you have the necessary knowledge, skills, abilities, and judgment to safely, competently, compassionately, and ethically perform the competency? So if you're not validated that you're able to do that competency and you don't have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment, then you stop and you seek further resources or supports. And definitely consult. Then you would say, does the nurse have the appropriate resources to perform and manage the outcomes of the activity? So do you have the emergency equipment in the practice setting in case something goes wrong? If it's no, then you stop, consult, and seek further supports and advice. If you say yes, then you move on to the next question. Would a reasonable and prudent nurse perform the competency in the practice setting? Think about it. Is that something that you would think that a reasonable, prudent nurse, any nurse, would do in this practice setting? If you're unsure or don't know, or the answer is no, then you stop, consult, and seek additional supports. If it's yes, you move on to the final question. Is the nurse prepared to accept accountability for the activity, competency, intervention, or role, and for the related outcomes? If the answer is no, then you stop and you seek further advice or supports. And if it's yes, then the nurse may perform the activity or intervention or role or competency to acceptable and prevailing standards of safe nursing care. So that's a decision tree that you can use as a support to answer that question, am I allowed to do that? And should I perform that competency? As I said, within that document, we have a number of questions that you can use. It's a clinical decision-making process, and it's a number of reflective questions. And in that document, they'll ask you to consider, is the competency within your legislated scope of practice? And there's further information under each of these questions that you can think about when you're considering, should you proceed to perform a competency, and are you allowed to do that? Then the next question is, do I have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment to perform the competency? Is the competency supported by my employer and practice setting? Is performing the competency in the best interest of the client? And do I assume individual accountability when acting within my individual scope of practice? So these questions are things to consider. And if the RN and NP answers yes to all of these reflections, then the RN and NP is most likely able to perform the competency. If the RN or NP is uncertain or answers no to any of these reflective questions, then more information will be required before proceeding any further. And the RN and NP may refer their questions to their manager or professional practice department. And they are also encouraged to connect with a college nursing consultant for policy and practice if they have questions related to their scope of practice. So, if you are unsure or don't know, or is a definite no, you don't have these things in place, then maybe it's the best to stop and consult. But if you're confident that the answer is yes to all of these things, then you can proceed. The next document is employers adding a new emerging competency to the scope of practice of an RN, NP, or practice setting. And this document provides a decision-making process that employers can use to add a new and emerging competency to the scope of practice of RNs and NPs within a particular practice setting. And under the scope of practice framework, regional health authorities and employers and organizations have been granted authority by the college to incorporate new and/or emerging competencies into the scope of practice of RNs and NPs within their employment setting, provided that key principles are met. So the college developed a decision-making framework that can be used by the employer to inform their process for advancing nursing scope of practice. And this framework incorporates a principle-based approach to stimulate critical evaluation of proposed scope of practice changes. So the college does not regulate the employer or the RHAs. We regulate individual registered nurses, but we also wanted to develop some resources for the employer that they can use when they're thinking about adding new and emerging competencies to RNs or NPs, or they're thinking about adding a competency that has not been performed in a particular practice setting. And now they want RNs and NPs to be doing that in that unit. So there is a process. And I draw your attention now to the next slide, where this is the decision-making framework that we developed that can aid the employer when they're contemplating adding a new and emerging competency to RN or NP scopes of practice. So in this decision tree, or decision-making framework, the employer would identify if a client need is required, what is the new competency that needs to be added, and then they would validate that they have supports. They might need support from professional practice or senior management, that we're going to add that new and emerging competency. And then they validate their process with the college decision-making process, and ensuring that there's key principles that they're allowing, and have reviewed the definition of practice as an RN and NP and the scope of practice framework. And then they collaborate with relevant disciplines for bringing that competency into the scope of an RN or NP. Then they would establish education and administrative policies to allow or to enable that new competency to be added. They can consult with the college when required, if they're unsure of a process, and or if it meets the definition of practice as a registered nurse or nurse practitioner. And then they would provide education to the RNs or the NPs and validate the NP and RN competency, that they're able to competently perform the skill or intervention that is required. And then they implement the competency into the client care. And then it's really important to perform ongoing evaluation. And so from that process, we hope that the employer would establish their own process using our framework for adding new and emerging competencies to the scope of practice of registered nurses. And they certainly can connect with us if they need assistance. The next document is assignment of care, and this document outlines the practice expectations for RNs and NPs who are responsible for preparing assignments of care for nursing care providers within their practice setting. And within that document, it defines assignment of care. And assignment of care is the process of designating and assigning the accountability and responsibility for meeting clients' care requirements for a specific period of time to an individual who is competent to provide the care. And the care is within the individual scope or scope of employment for our unregulated care providers. So you need to think about, what are the individual scopes of practice of those within your healthcare team, your collaborative team? And unregulated care providers, or PCAs, personal care attendants, whatever name that you have, they're called within your practice setting, they are not a regulated healthcare professional. So they operate under a scope of employment or a job description. So you need to be aware what's within their individual scope. And assignment of care is the knowledge-based process of matching the most appropriate healthcare provider based on the assessment of the client's needs. So now, no longer are there days that you would assign an RN, LPN, PCA to rooms 102, 103, 104. Here's the RN. LPN does 105, 6, and 7. And the unregulated care provider will provide care 108, 109, 110. You need to know what are the care needs of the client and what competencies those individual health nursing care providers have, and assign them appropriately. So when you're doing assignment of care, here's some things to consider. Whether it's the RN or NP who's performing assignment of care, whether as a charge nurse or the clinical educator, the care facilitator, PCC, you need to determine who is the right healthcare provider for the client in the right place at the right time for the right reason. And so that person who's doing assignment of care must consider first the client. You need to consider the acuity, the complexity, and variability of the client's condition or situation. Because remember, RNs can autonomously provide care no matter the predictability or complexity, acuity of a client. The client's plan of care is an established plan of care, or there is no established plan of care. The predictability of the outcome of care. Then you think about the nurse, okay, whether it's an RN, an LPN, the nurse practitioner, or an unregulated care provider. You need to know the scope of practice of each of those individual nursing care providers within that practice setting. And as I said, what is the scope of employment for the unregulated care provider? What does it say in the job description that that unregulated care provider can do? And you need to know what the competency level and expertise of each of those individual providers. Are they competent? Do they have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment to perform that competency? And if not, then we need to think about, what do we need to provide to these individuals in order to bring it into their scope of practice, their individual competence, what education requirements are needed so they have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment. And if you assign someone to a client where they're expected to perform competencies that's not within their individual competence, they need to speak up to that nurse who has done the assignment of care, because either the care has to be reassigned or there may be some continuing education that needs to be done to bring that competency into the competency of that individual nursing care provider. And then we look at the environment. What is the context of practice in which care is provided? Can you do that competency that is required of the client in this practice setting? And we need to think about the resources and supports available to the nursing care provider. Is there mentorship? Can you support that registered nurse or nurse practitioner or a nursing care provider? Can you mentor them during that assignment of care? Can you supervise? Maybe there's a skill that's required and you haven't done it a lot, and maybe you just want that experienced RN with that competency to watch you perform that or to validate that. Preceptorship, you may be preceptoring and assisting the individual nurse care providers through that assignment of care so that they obtain those competencies and is able to fulfill that assignment of care. And you need to think about, is there employer policies that support you to perform those competencies that's required of the client? Any procedures, any protocols, clinical decision tools, guidelines, and also your job and role descriptions. And also, do you have the supports and the supplies to perform the competencies that are required in that assignment of care? Next is the care directives, a pre-printed order document. And this document outlines the practice expectations for RNs and NPs implementing care or medical directives or pre-printed orders to carry out specific competencies that are within the scope of practice of the RN, but would otherwise require a client-specific direct order from an authorized prescriber. And this document is specifically for RNs because NPs are authorized prescribers. So I just want to point that out. And we previously had called our document medical directives and pre-printed orders, but through literature review and advances, we now call it a care directive. So care or medical directive, what is it? It's a written order from an authorized prescriber, whether it's a physician, nurse practitioner, pharmacist, dentist, or midwife, for example, for a competency or a series of interventions that may be implemented for a number of clients when specific conditions are met and when specific conditions exist. So specifics will depend on the client population, the nature of the orders involved, and the expertise of the healthcare professionals implementing the care directive, and is only initiated if the health condition occurs. So a key point here in medical or care directive is that the competency is within the scope of a registered nurse, but the registered nurse requires a direct order if this medical directive did not exist. So it's a substitute when that written order does not exist. The medical directive may be present on the unit when there may not be a physician or a nurse practitioner to write that order immediately. So the care directive is a written order or employer policy developed in consultation with an authorized prescriber or a number of prescribers for a competency or series of interventions to be implemented by another care provider for a range of clients with identified health conditions or needs when specific circumstances are met or exist. They apply to a range of clients who meet identified criteria such as age or diagnosis. They do not require additional client-specific authorization. It does require the RN's professional assessment, judgment, and evaluation, and it allows for discretionary use. So based upon the RN's assessment and professional judgment, that critical thinking, the nurse has the flexibility to determine if and when to implement a care directive and when follow-up is required if the directive is not implemented. For example, they may have to notify the authorized prescriber that, the individual presented to the emergency department, we have a medical directive that authorizes the registered nurse to, if someone comes in with a high temp, febrile neutropenia is the diagnosis, and there's an elevated temp, these conditions exist, then the RN can order, start an IV, start this particular antibiotic, order a chest x-ray, but if for some reason all of those specific circumstances are not met or exist, then they would notify the authorized prescriber that they have not implemented that medical directive. It is an optional component of the client's record, so the employer may or may not require you to put a copy on the client's chart. It may just exist in the unit in a paper form. It could be electronic form. And really important to know that these care directives are based on evidence-informed best practices. And if there's a change in best practices, then they need to be updated. And some examples of care directives could include the immunization schedule in public and community care environments. Triage-related interventions in emergency departments are just some examples. Then we look at pre-printed orders. In that document, it outlines what are pre-printed orders. Well, they're written orders that are specific to a client and their health condition. They are used to ensure consistency of intervention in client care. Again, they too are based on evidence-informed best practices and need to be updated if there's changes in evidence-informed best practices. And when used, the client is first assessed by the authorized prescriber, who then selects appropriate interventions from a set of pre-printed orders. And these pre-printed orders are usually stamped with the client's demographic, your so you would use that would be stamped on it, or again, going into electronic realms now, it could be electronic pre-printed order where everything is checked off and you have electronic signature. They apply to a specific client and health condition. They require client-specific authorization from the authorized prescriber before implementation, and they're intended to be implemented as written unless the RN determines a client-specific contraindication such as an allergy, and they must be signed and included in the client's record. So the RN, using clinical judgment again, if the pre-printed order subsets cannot be followed, then they would not follow that pre-printed order, and they would notify the authorized prescriber that there is a specific contraindication or issue where they didn't implement it. And then finally, we think about the scope of practice of the collaborative team. So, the scope of practice framework talks specifically about the scope of practice of the nursing profession, the scope of practice of the individual registered nurse and nurse practitioner, and the newly graduated RN and NP. But we all work within collaborative teams. So it's really important as a part of a collaborative team that you have access and you understand the individual scopes of practice of those healthcare professionals within your team. And you'll see in this diagram that oftentimes competencies from different healthcare professionals intersect, and that we share competencies. For example, licensed practical nurses, we share a lot of competencies. Licensed practical nurses and RNs and NPs can do medication administration. You can do catheterization, blood and blood products, central venous access devices. Within the COVID pandemic, we had nurse practitioners, RNs, NPs doing swabbing for COVID-19, doing vaccinations. So you need to be aware that within that collaborative team, each of those individual healthcare professionals bring their own individual competencies, and you see that with the circles that are independent. But you also see those circles that intersect because they're shared. And there may be times when you work with physicians on your unit, nurse practitioners. There could be allied health, such as physiotherapists, RTs, respiratory therapists, that share competencies with you. But when you're providing that care, we must be aware of the individual scopes of practice of all of our team members and to work collaboratively with them. And when collaboration and effective communication is needed to carry out the client's needs, that you ensure that there is effective communication and collaboration so that we identify the client's needs and that their needs are provided for, and you perform the competencies that are within your individual competencies. So I just wanted to highlight our new website. If you look on this screen, you'll see that there's two methods to access the documents that I talked about. First is the search engine, and you can type in here scope of practice framework or care directives. But we also have the 3 lines that's called a hamburger. And here, if you click here, you'll go into practice. And then we go under practice resources and then practice topics. And this is where all of our documents are located. So they're done by topics. We have the code of ethics, we have the standards of practice, but scope of practice, this is where all of our documents are stored for scope of practice. And we have a number of other documents other than the scope of practice framework and the suite of documents. We also have insulin adjustment, but we also have some additional resources. So when we send out the Regulation Matters, which is the regulatory newsletter that comes after each of the council's meetings, we sometimes put in regulation challenges or quizzes to help you understand the documents that we are approved by council. So in June, when council approved the scope of practice framework, we actually put a quiz in the Regulation Matters for you to just reflect on applying that scope of practice framework to your practice. So as I said, we have a number of documents, and you can find those there. We also have trending topics, which are the NP regulation information. We're exploring changes to NP regulation nationally. We have RN prescribing, and there's information on COVID pandemic. And I just want to draw your attention to this education session that we're having today. You can use that for your CCP hours, and you would go into My CRNNL, into My CCP to log your hours. So really important that you capture the learning that you did today, and that can be used to go towards the 24 hours of learning that is required for licensure renewal. And licensure renewal occurs each year, and the deadline is March 1st. So just a little bit about the website and where to find the information. So thank you. I guess I should also just to talk a little bit of how you can connect with the College of Registered Nurses. So we have a number of social media platforms now that we use to connect with the college. We have Facebook, so go in and like our page. We have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have the College of Registered Nurses YouTube, and today this session will be recorded and then stored in YouTube, but then stored under our archived events so that you can go in and view this presentation at another time. Our physical location is 55 Military Road. Here's our telephone number to call us. We also have the 1-800 number, 1-800-563-3200. We have our website, www.crnnl.ca. And also want to draw your attention to the new practice team email. So to get resources out to you from the practice team for Peggy and I, we use this practice team. So you're going to see emails from the practice team. We also created in January what's called Notes from the Practice Team. And in that Notes from the Practice Team, it contains information from a regulatory perspective, like we give you information about the new CCP program, but there is also key information from from stakeholders that we engage with that provide us with clinical information that is relevant to your practice. So when you see an email from the practice team, please ensure that you read it, because there's key information there that will assist you in your practice setting.